seawater's on the way.
Oh, okay.
Sanje Judan Zoje Jonam Jonja Bardo Dane Jazoje Dage Jinzoje Senanje Roma Benje Sanje Roma Joy Sanje Judan Nam Lai Jam Jam Bando Dani Gyamtso Dage Jinloi Jime Dola Benje Sanje Drombai Joy Sanje Jun Zoje Jonam Lai Jam Jam Bando Dani Gyamtso Dage Jinzo Jimbe Zanam Je Rola Benje San Drama Jo Semjen Tamje Dewa Dan Deve Chuna Nembaran Jaje Dunga Dan Dunga Ji Jalan Rawa Jaje Dunga Mebe Dewa Damba Dame Rawa Jaje Nyering Jada Nyedam Ra Donyam Jambola Nema Joy Semjen Tamje Dewa Dan Deve Judan Dembar Jaje Anandunga Jijalan Rawa Jaja Dunga Mebe Damba Damerawa Jaja Nyering Chada Nyedan Danyam Jambola Neba Joje Semjen Damje Dewa Dan Deve Judan Tembar Joy Anandunga Ji Judan Rawa Joje Dunga Me Dewa Damba Damerawa Joje Nyering Chala Nyilanda Danyam Jambola Neba Joje Dada Semjen Damje Lo Chusun Rawa Jinja Landozo Chelanda Rawa Jinja Landozo Chelbai Amcha Sawa Jinja Landozo Lama Yeshe Jawa Jinja Landozo Dada Zemjen Tamje Lo Chuzo Rawa Jinja Landozo Landa Rawa Jinja Landozo Mam Choba Sawa Jinja Landozo Lama Yeshe Jawa Jinja Landozo Dada Zemjen Tamje Lo Chuzo Rawa Jinja Landozo Chelanda Rawa Jinja Landozo Lam Droba Sawa Jinja Landozo My Yeshe Jawa Jinja Landozo No Jan Zambe Mage Saradon Ya Zen Joge Madunye Be Majone Jesono Gora Do Gandro Azo Dan Rum Je Jandira Jambala Jandala Wanshi Gorgela Loren Baraja Zochadanomo Benzragor Amazebehom Om Benzragor Bemadrengetsa Benzrazamaya Zarbasinde Balahum Ariamaharinis Anzarian Zendarem Sung Jinjamaya Angelo Wajegorwara Jinjama Jujendamba Jinjalo Lamje Jombara Jinjalo Gurjendamba Jinjalo Benzragor Bemadewandaki Kaya Abekinzom Vaga Abekinsa Zinda Abekinzahum Sarva Abekinsar. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. Please, as always, generate bodhicitta as your motivation for listening to the teachings with the thought that you are listening to this so that it can help you bring all beings to Buddhahood. The text that we have begun studying is called Clear Guidance on the generation stage, common to the four Guru sadhanas, Guru Rinpoche sadhanas of the Barway Dorje tradition. Those of you who are familiar with the Guru Rinpoche practice that we do on the 10th day, or with any of the other practices done here, will notice that the stages of the ritual, and we're just about to get into a number of short mentions of ritual stages. The stages of the ritual correspond exactly to what is done, at least in group practice, and especially in what is called Drupchen, or great accomplishment. Those of you who are familiar with practices of other lineages of the Tersar, or New Terma, such as the Dujum Tersar, Choling Tersar, Jinse Tersar, and so on, will also recognize the same stages. When it comes to other traditions, some of the older Termas and so on, while they're the same in essence, the order can be slightly different. Now, when Barway Dorje taught this many years ago, he did not comment extensively on most of the ritual aspects. And he chose to emphasize more the essence of the whole thing. So I'm going to follow his example as best I can. Before we get into, and those who were following in the text were on page 41, we've just completed the middle section of the page, which dealt with the generation of bodhicitta. And now we come to the first thing is the offering of what are called gektor, or torma for obstructors. And much of this and the next few steps that are on the same page are things you don't do in daily practice usually. They're done in group practices, or as I say, during the Drupchen. But before we get to the individual steps, I think it would be best if we familiarized ourselves briefly with the central concept, which is going to appear again and again in the ritual stages. And this is the concept of outer, inner, and secret. Sometimes it's fourfold, in which case it's outer, inner, secret, and very secret. The meaning of this, in a very simple way, is that we inhabit three worlds. We inhabit the external world, the outer world, with which we engage through our five senses. And we inhabit the internal world of our bodies. And of course, the inhabitor of the other two worlds is the secret world of our mind, which is called secret not because it's shameful, but because it is something that no one else can see. People can come in contact with your body, but we only learn of somebody else's mind through communication, physical or verbal. Now, our emphasis in inhabiting these three worlds can vary a bit. For example, if we become very upset, very worried, we may retreat strongly into the secret world of our mind. If we're physically ill, we become preoccupied by sensations in the internal world of our body. And when those two situations are not present, if external stimuli attract us or repel us strongly enough, we become very involved with them. Pleasant objects of the five senses, or threatening or unpleasant ones. Now, the reason I mention this is because as we go through the outer, inner, and secret aspects of this, that, and the other thing, which we'll do fairly quickly, understand that this is because everything that seems external, also has an internal and a secret, you could say, aspect or presence. The text continues, food and fist impressions for creditors are external tormas. A torma is an offering, usually an edible offering, that is, as the word indicates, cast out or given away. Sometimes it's explained that tor means to cast away veils, and ma means to have loving kindness like a mother for her children. The external torma here is the physical torma, and here mentioned are two types of things, food in general, and often, as you know, we make tormas in particular shapes and paint them and ornament them in various ways, and what are called fist impressions or handles. Fist impressions are when you take some dough, or in some countries, cooked rice, and you press your fingers into it so that it forms an image of, I think it's 5 valleys and 6 ridges. And we're taught that this goes back to a female preta during the Buddha's time who had 500 children. And to feed them, she needed to take the life force of 500 people, I guess a day. And so he said to her, if you will stop doing that, I guarantee that all my present and future followers will dedicate a little bit of food to you. So we find this, for example, in the Buddhist monastic tradition, where people will make these fist impressions or handles at the end of the midday meal. It's also done during many rituals that are primarily concerned with the removal of obstacle. And the reason for this is that we have karmic debts. There are beings that we have harmed, countless beings. And those of them that are non-human currently can be satisfied by any sincere act of reparation or generosity, because as we say, it's the thought that counts. And so when you offer a fist impression or a little torma to what we call obstructors or creditors, the meaning of it is great for them. So that's an external torma. The internal torma, performing giving and taking with great compassion, is the internal torma. The internal torma is the attitude and meditation of trying to be less selfish. A lot of times in Buddhism, when we talk about the cause of suffering, we say it's the false imputation of a truly existent personal self, which is true, but it's also a mouthful, and it doesn't really impact us that much. But if we say the cause of suffering is our selfishness, I think that reaches us where we are. So the internal torma is the offering of taking on the suffering of others, including creditors, and giving them your happiness and your goodness. And it's internal because it is the guiding principle behind any external karma. The exhaustion of I, the self, in the expanse is, oh sorry, I skipped the secret one. The arising of the poisons as wisdom is the secret dharma. That refers to what we pray for in the four dharmas of Gyamtso, which we just chanted. Grant your blessing that bewilderment arise as wisdom. The true nature of our kleshas, our poisons, is wisdom. However, they don't manifest that way to us in our deluded state because we see them as what they are not. So the secret dharma, the secret relinquishment of veils and cultivation of impartial love for all beings, is when what were previously kleshas arise as wisdom. Oh, I skipped a whole paragraph. All right, well, we'll go back to that. The exhaustion of I, the self, in the expanse is the very secret dharma. This doesn't mean that you disappear. It means that you were never there to begin with. It doesn't mean that experience diminishes in its intensity, but probably the simplest way I've ever heard this explained by a teacher is, if I existed, everyone in this room would call me I, but you don't. You call me you or them. Now, to get back to the paragraph that I missed, in the banishment of obstructors, enemies, obstructive spirits, elementals, and harmers are external obstructors. External obstructors are other beings who have a problem with us because either of something we did, in many cases in previous lives, or because they are terribly tormented by their own afflictions, or for a combination of the two reasons. So the first key point in relating to external obstructors is empathy. Whether they seek to obstruct or harm you because of things you did in a previous life, and they are unwittingly called upon to get back at you, or because they are so tormented by their own misery that they don't know how to do anything other than strike out at others. If you think about it in that way, the only way to relate to such beings is with empathy and compassion. Sickness, demons, and obstacles are internal obstructors. In this case, demons is more the internal demons, like we say he is wrestling with his demons, or she is wrestling with her demons, and so on. And we all have these. We have these until the moment of Buddhahood. And one thing that we must never ever do, especially within a Sangha, is to be unkind or uncompassionate when someone else is wrestling with their demons. Because if we can't be compassionate to other members of the Sangha, what hope is there being compassionate for anyone else? Kleshas, the five poisons, are secret obstructors. So the innermost or secret obstructor within your mind is your attachment, aversion, pride, jealousy, and ignorance. And ignorance, self-fixation, is the very secret obstructor. This is, among other things, what is meant when it's said that even external obstructors are the display of your own self-fixation. It's not that they don't exist, it's not that we don't have problems with other beings, but on a very deep level, they reflect or embody or mirror, we could say, our own selfishness. So, skipping the next paragraph, which I did first because new glasses, after the obstructor's torma has been sent out, the next thing is creating a perimeter, a border or boundary. The external, internal, secret, and very secret perimeters are those established, respectively, through mudra. Mudra can mean physical gestures, and gesture is very important, but it can also mean the form of deities, so visualization. Wisdom, through recognition of the true nature of things, that establishes the inner perimeter of emptiness. Undistracted samadhi, which is being able to maintain a state of unwavering focus, and the exhaustion of I, the self, in the expanse. Now, this term expanse refers most commonly in this context of the generation stage to the Dharma Dhatu, the nature of all things. And because it is the nature of all things, it is therefore inclusive of all things, and is therefore called a vast expanse. Next, there are 3 or 4 further ritual steps that are, in most of our liturgies, very short. And they are the opening of the symbolic doors, which is a symbolic opening of the doors of the mandala, the salutation to the deities, and the confession. And the confession here is the confession of not having known that your mind is Buddha. It's the ultimate confession, which in a sense, if you think about it, includes all other things we've done wrong, because that's the starting point. If we knew that our mind was Buddha, we would never do anything wrong. Now these, each of these, the opening of the symbolic doors and the salutation and the confession, again have outer, inner, and secret aspects. Externally, the view of the external appearances of the environment and its inhabitants as clarity, emptiness, the mandala of deities. So that means in the opening of the doors, the salutation and the confession, on an external level, you're acknowledging or reminding yourself that while you may not see things that way yet, the true nature of the environment and all beings is deities. Internally, the knowledge that one's own body aggregates and elements have always been the peaceful and wrathful deities. We have form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. And each of these consists of many, many things, so we call them aggregates. We also have bodies that include solidity, liquid, air, heat, and space. Because we suffer, because many of our sensations are miserable, many of our perceptions are negative, our mental formations cause us trouble and seem out of our control, and consciousness is complicated for us. And because we suffer so much physically, if the environment is not exactly what we need, we get sick. It's amazing. When I'm not sick, I can't remember this. But it's amazing how little it takes to make us sick. So for those reasons, we tend to project impurity on the aggregates and elements. But that is our projection. The true nature of the 5 aggregates is that they are the 5 male Sambhogakaya Buddhas. The true nature of the 5 elements is that they are the 5 female Sambhogakaya Buddhas. They don't become that because we believe it, they are that. So that's the internal acknowledgement. And then, secretly, the view of coarse and subtle thoughts as luminous wisdom. As Buddhists, we're often involved with a struggle with our thoughts. I've made no secret of the fact that I suffer from what I think I can now call severe anxiety, which is carried in packets of thought. And even if we don't suffer from any particular form of grossly dysfunctional thinking, we came to meditation because we didn't like our thoughts, mostly. And therefore, we're not particularly to blame if when we begin to practice meditation, we see it as symptomatic relief from our thoughts. For example, when I'm extremely agitated, I can calm myself to some extent, depending on circumstances, by focusing exclusively on the breath. But the purpose of Buddhist meditation is not symptomatic relief. It is not the avoidance of thought. We have to be able to see what thoughts actually are. And that's why, for example, in the lineage prayer with which we began this morning, we said the nature of thoughts is Dharmakaya, as has been taught. Well, I'm not going to belabor this point now because it's capable of misinterpretation if you go through it too quickly. But basically, we should not think that we need to stop thinking. We need to have the ability to choose our thoughts. But we are not trying to lull or charm our minds into a state of stupor. Very secretly, these are the view of ignorance as awareness wisdom that is simultaneously realized and liberated. Simultaneous realization and liberation refers to what happens when someone gets it. They get the wisdom of Buddhahood so strongly that their realization of it, which it's not the same as understanding, but it's kind of like super understanding, is so tremendous and unchangeable that they are liberated on the spot. For example, the Buddha's disciple, King Indrabhuti of Udyana, was said to have been liberated in this way when he asked the Buddha to teach, and the Buddha taught the Guhya Samaja Tantra. Indrabhuti and his whole court achieved rainbow bodies on the spot. But simultaneous realization and liberation is not only a very highfalutin way of being liberated. It is possible for that to happen because that is what awareness, wisdom, or Lama Yeshe is. It is already self-realizing and liberated. Now that's always a difficult point for us because we know that we are struggling. And sometimes our struggle, our agony, can get to the point where the Dharma seems very far away. At such times it may be helpful to remember that we are talking here not so much about something we wish to attain, well that too, as the way things already are, the way things always have been. Probably the best known analogy for this is you're afraid of snakes and you open a door into a darkened room and you see what looks like a coiled snake. You suffer because you're afraid. But then when you turn on a light, you see it's actually a rope that was used by painters and has speckles of different colored paint on it. The snake was never there. There wasn't a snake. Problem we have, of course, is that we won't believe it until we're able to turn the light on. We need proof because we're so afraid. The confession is the admission that one has previously not realized these, so that we have not recognized our own minds, the nature of our minds as Buddha. The salutation is respect and enthusiasm for and recognition of these. And then the next thing is a promise, which basically is saying, I'm not going to give up. The promise is vowing to complete the external, internal, secret, and very secret accomplishments. So in other words, you're promising to do your best to perfect all these 4 stages of the path. The next section in our practices is called the descent of blessings. The descent of blessings occurs through the force of one's devoted urging of all victors, or Buddhas, of the 5 bodies. The bodies, speech, minds, qualities, and activity of all Buddhas arise as rupakayas, or form bodies, and bless one, one's retinue, and all one's materials as wisdom in nature. So this is still a preliminary in the sense that it precedes the actual generation stage, and therefore is something that you usually would not do in your private or personal practice, which tends to be more abbreviated. But it's very important because it is in group practice, because it is the Well, I think the simplest way to say it is a sincere, heartfelt prayer for the blessing of all Buddhas on you and on the practice materials, on the other participants, and even on the room. Then the next section, and the second to last of the preliminaries, is the blessing of offerings. Before we get into the text, we bless offerings because we have concepts about them. We think this offering is so big but not any bigger. It's a little skimpy. Or we think that torma is leaning to the side a little bit. Or we think, oh, that's pretty funky. We have concepts. So the text says, all apprehension of the substantial reality of the offerings, because to get rid of our concepts, we have to get rid of our projection of substantial reality. All thoughts of their attributes or characteristics, and all habits are purified by wisdom, fire, wind, and water, respectively. The imagery here comes from the Abhidharma idea of how worlds or solar systems come to an end, sometimes with fire, sometimes with wind, and sometimes with water. So the idea is that these three elements can get rid of stuff. So wisdom fire burns away the substantial reality of the offerings in your imagination. Wisdom wind blows away all the habits of substantiality, because a concept and a habit of the concept are two slightly different things. So it's like the offerings are burnt to ashes, and then the ashes are blown away. And then, that's all thoughts of their characteristics, like ashes, and then all habits are purified by the water, which cleanses the place where the ashes were. The external offerings are then blessed as the usual divine articles. Divine articles are such things as one would find in a god realm. So traditionally, they are at least water for drinking, because Buddhism comes from a hot country. So the first thing you do when you greet or receive someone, is you find out if they're thirsty. Then water for washing the feet. Then flowers with which you receive someone. Then incense to sweeten the room and bring them on their way. I always get the order wrong. Then light can be a butter flame, can be electric light, the light of the sun and the moon and the stars. Light is something that's very precious to us. And then perfume or cologne, which kind of has the connotation of a little bit, it's not a total ablution ritual, we have those too, but a little bit like you give the means to become clean. Then food, and then music. Now the actual list can vary. There are sometimes more than that, sometimes fewer, but that's the most common. The internal offerings are multiplied until they are Samantabhadra-like desirable qualities. The Bodhisattva, in this case it's the Bodhisattva Samantabhadra, not the Dharmakaya. One of Samantabhadra's miracles described in the Avatamsaka Sutra is the ability, through his aspiration, to multiply things exponentially by powers of 10. So Samantabhadra, if Samantabhadra were to offer the Buddha, let's say, a begging bowl of food, he could cause it to turn into 10, each of which would turn into 10, each of which would turn into 10, and so on ad infinitum. So finally, anything that Samantabhadra wishes to offer becomes what's called a sky treasury, which means an inexhaustible amount of constantly replicating, never finished, useful, beneficial things that fill all space. The secret offerings are blessed as Amrita, Rakta, and Torma through the union, emission, and withdrawal of Samaya and the wisdom syllables and Buddhas of the 5 families, and as desirable vidyas whose nature is wisdom gods and goddesses. The offering of that alone is beyond thought, description, and the intellect. Sometimes Amrita, Rakta, and Torma are called inner offerings, and sometimes they're called secret offerings. And the Amrita literally means deathless. So in legend, it is what the gods or devas drink. Like in the ancient Greek religion, I think they had ambrosia. But this is a liquid. It's what the gods drink that gives them immortality. So what Amrita represents is the immortality of wisdom. And also those of you who are around here a lot know that we also use the term Amrita to refer to those little brown tiny balls or pills that are blessed using a very elaborate form of ceremony, and that are primarily made up of many different herbs. Rakta can mean red or blood. And so the offering of Rakta is because blood is life. Amrita is immortality, but which is kind of like lifespan. Rakta is life force, biological life itself. So when you offer Rakta, you're kind of saying to all these deities, if I offer you symbolically the blood of all beings, and obviously wisdom Buddhist deities don't drink blood, they're not vampires, they're Buddhas. But you say, if I offer you all these beings, their blood, their very life force, you have to take care of them. You have to liberate them. So it's a little bit like, I suppose you could say, like giving someone a rescue animal and saying, I really wanted you to have this. I know you would like to have this. Here's this. Now please take care of it and feed it and so on. There are many, many other meanings to these, however, because there's the notion of white and red as kind of elemental colors and lots of other stuff. And then Torma is the Torma that's offered to the wisdom deities. And again, sometimes these are called secret offerings. Sometimes one is inner, one is secret, one is very secret, and there's a lot. The final offering, the offering of that alone, is beyond thought, description, and the intellect. It's actually offering the nature of reality, the nature of your mind, to the deities. All of which begs the question, do they need any of this? Of course not. Buddhas accept these offerings for our good. And then the final preliminary is the clarification. And this is that up to this point, you've been engaged in a fair amount of somewhat detail-oriented ritual. Before you segue into the main practice, you need to not step back, but you need to remind yourself what you're doing here. Because the danger, or a danger, is that we can become so preoccupied with the symbolism of transformation and the use of our imagination that we forget that what we're doing in these practices is acknowledging the way things already are. And we use the symbolism of transformation and the faculty of our imaginations because we don't yet see them as they are. But we know they are. Or if we don't know, we're prepared to believe, or if we're not prepared to believe, we're prepared to take a chance that they are. It's a little bit like when you come back into your room in the middle of the night and there's no light. You can't see where stuff is, or at least I can't. If you're trying to rely upon vision, direct vision, you're going to fall over something. But you might remember. Oh yeah, my bed's over here. I don't want to fall over it. I want to walk around it and get into it properly. So it's a little bit like that. We acknowledge that we don't see things as they are, but we ask of ourselves to at least bring that to mind. Okay, and now we're about to get into the main practice. The text says the main format is the three samadhis. Now this can be confusing to people because the three samadhis seem to occur rather quickly in the liturgy and precede what you spend most of your time doing, which is imagining deities and saying mantras and whatnot. But from the standpoint of Mahayoga, the three samadhis are very important. In Anuyoga and Ati Yoga, they may or may not be present. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't. But from the standpoint of Mahayoga, the three samadhis are very important. So the three samadhis correspond to the nature of things, the ground of purification, that is to say, not what needs to be purified, but what doesn't change. Also, to what needs to be purified. Also, to how we came into the world. And finally, to the manifestation when you become a Buddha of the three bodies or three kayas. All dharmas of samsara and nirvana have been pure from the beginning. Existence and tranquility, that means samsara and nirvana, were never created by anyone. The unborn Dharmakaya, beyond elaboration and beyond the intellect, is the samadhi of just like that. So the samadhi of just like that means the samadhi that is the contemplation of the true nature of all things. By contemplating the true nature of all things, then, which is the nature of ground, we seek to purify the moment of death, which means that we prepare ourselves, if we can, to recognize that ground, clear light as it's called, at the moment after death. And if we can do that, then we achieve liberation and Buddhahood as they put it, in the Dharmakaya. So this first samadhi corresponds to the moment of a Buddha's awakening, when it's not good to say they become Dharmakaya, but they achieve the Dharmakaya. In practice, at least if you don't have a strong, stable view of the nature of things, at least it is the contemplation of emptiness. The second, I didn't go through the clarification in detail. The clarification is the recollection that one's aggregates and elements have always been deities, that one's channels and winds have also always been syllables and the sound of mantra, the thoughts have always been the Rupakaya, and that awareness has always been the Dharmakaya. Knowing these to be such, one meditates on them as such. Okay, now back to the three samadhis. The second samadhi, which is called total radiance or appearing everywhere, is compassion. Compassion, the clear light, the unity of appearance, emptiness, and the wisdom of the unceasing Sambhogakaya are the samadhi of total radiance. In terms of the ground, or in the context of the ground of purification, well, the Dharmakaya is the nature of mind, the nature of all things. It is not exclusively, it is not we could say the only, it's tricky to use the word attribute, but it is not the only wisdom or goodness of mind. Because while mind's nature is emptiness, its character is cognitive lucidity. Now, in this context, cognitive lucidity arises in the second samadhi as universal compassion. And it does so, ideally, because the recognition of emptiness causes the practitioner to give rise to a type of compassion that is beyond what we normally experience or often experience, because it is the natural affect of realizing how unnecessary all our suffering is. So this is usually called compassion focused on dharmas. There's also a level of compassion even beyond that, but for our purposes here, this is enough for now. So, in the context of the ground, This is the attribute of the nature that is the Sambhogakaya, spontaneous presence, which manifests through compassion. In terms of what we are purifying, it purifies our experience of the bardo. So therefore, if someone does not recognize the ground clear light, they may be able to recognize what's called the apparent luminosity or apparent clear light, the peaceful and wrathful deities and so on. Although in this context that's not totally spelled out, but because that's more connected with the completion stage. But anyway, in practical terms, what you are doing here is resting in compassion as a motivation for continuing with the practice after that. So, as is often said, the second samadhi is the segue between the first samadhi, the samadhi of just like that, contemplation of the Dharmakaya or emptiness, and the third samadhi, which we're about to get to, which is really where the main practice of visualization begins. So, the second samadhi corresponds to the Sambhogakaya, both as a ground and as final attainment, and purifies our past and future experience of the bardo. Awareness, the display of emptiness and compassion as non-abiding wisdom, meditated upon as the causal vital syllable, is the samadhi of cause. Now, what you do at this point is you think that your awareness itself, which has both those attributes of emptiness and compassion, manifests as the seed syllable of the deity. So in the case of the Guru Rinpoche practice that we do here, it is Shri. In the case of Vajra Yogini, it is Vam. And in the case of other deities, it can be Hum or other syllables as well. In terms of the ground, this corresponds to the third attribute of the ground. If we speak of, we can talk about a mind, I suppose. Mind itself, its nature is emptiness, and its character is cognitive lucidity. But what about its goodness, its responsiveness? Its goodness is its responsiveness, in that the mind's cognitive lucidity is not limited. It can know anything, perhaps limited by senses and things like that, and that's the mind's goodness. That's the unity of its emptiness and its lucidity. Now we isolate these conceptually, but they're obviously not really three different things. If there were three different things, then the third thing couldn't be the unity of the first two. But it's helpful to Think of them sequentially. So this purifies the beginning of the process of conception and eventual birth. And it corresponds to, when someone attains Buddhahood, their manifestation from the Sambhogakaya of Nirmanakaya. Sometimes it's a little tricky to distinguish between the second and third. The second is compassion. The third is the goodness of that compassion. The actual entry, I think. Now that's the hardest stuff in this book, so it's now going to get easier again. The syllable's light purifies one's habitual apprehension of the external environment and its inhabitants as real and endowed with characteristics or attributes. The subsequent external aspect is meditation on the pure elements, a pure realm, a palace, and oneself as a deity. So, depending upon the specific practice, you will have the mandalas of the elements, then usually on top of them, Mount Meru in some form, and then on top of that, a palace, and within the palace will be the seed syllable, which will then sometimes directly and sometimes it will first become a scepter and then become the deity. The well, I don't want to belabor the point. The internal aspect is meditation on the pure five elements of one's components, one's body as a palace, and one's mind itself as a deity. When you do the visualization, you identify your body-mind with the body of the deity inside the palace. But there's also a sense in which you recognize that the palace represents your body. And the elements and so on beneath it represent components of your body. And so while the deity is your body-mind, it is also your mind inside the palace, which has four doors because of the four senses other than touch and the four mindfulnesses and lots of reasons. There are 37 features to any of these palaces. They can be peaceful or wrathful, but they almost all have certain features. So externally, you identify the mandala with you as the deity in the center of it, as the whole world. But internally, and think back to what we talked about at the beginning, it's the internal world of your body. And this is not really a contradiction, because if you think about how we inhabit the external world, we relate to the external world through our five senses. We experience it, what we think of as out there, in here. And finally, obviously by definition, anything you experience with your mind. So therefore it says, the secret aspect is the complete appearance of the grounds, paths, and results of the 9 vehicles as a magic circle of deities. That means that in this tradition, the mandala, whichever mandala it is, will embody, and there are commentaries that we get into exhaustive detail about each of this, every aspect of the fruition of Buddhahood, such as the 10 strengths and so on, and every aspect of the path, all the different vehicles and so on. All of these things are embodied in the deities. And the significance to that, well, there are many, but one is that by meditating on these deities in that way, you can expeditiously traverse the path and achieve the results of the qualities of Buddhahood. The very secret aspect is the mandala of absolute truth, the spontaneously present great perfection of everything in self-awareness, bodhicitta. I think we're going through so much that I think we should take some questions even this morning, because otherwise it's going to just be like a, whirlwind tour. Jeff, are we set up for questions?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So we have about 45 minutes this morning.
Thank you for the teaching, Lama Yeshe. I really appreciate it. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll just ask one. With the obstacle aversion practices that we do, I sometimes find myself, it can almost like harden my sense of self and other and hope and fear and things like that. Mm-hmm. And then I recently heard a teaching where they were, what was he was saying, it was a Guru Rinpoche obstacle aversion prayer, and it was against famine, and the way he expressed it, it was like more of the inner famine, like of constantly having to need more type of thing rather than external. But it just seems like sometimes these practices are meant like explicitly like what we would normally think of as like an external obstacle and making that not happen. But it doesn't seem at all like all of it at all. And it seems a lot more deeper, but I'm just kind of working through it, but I'm just wondering if you can give me insights into that.
The way that this has been explained to me is that on the path, we are trying to do two things. One is achieve Buddhahood as quickly as possible, because if we do that, or when we do that, we'll be in the best position to help others in every way. But we also seek to help others in short-term, what you could call short-term ways, even while still on the path. So, for example, if you read Shantideva's aspiration at the end of the Bodhicharyavatara, he talks about wanting to become medicine, wanting to become a bridge, wanting to become this. We should not ignore any possibility we have of being useful or helpful to others. Now the problem, of course, or a problem, is that in many cases we seek to be helpful to others before we've even learned not to be a nuisance to others. Just speaking personally, that I've had a really hard time with that. And so the starting point, the basis of this, has to be making sure that whatever you do does not cause harm. So when you repel obstacles, you don't have to be reinforcing the thought of self and other, because usually they're not just your obstacles. And it doesn't have to be involve any kind of enmity or demonization of beings. And that's how it's been explained to me.
Thank you for the teaching, Lama Yeshe. When I heard the phrase simultaneously realized and liberated, I was wondering, is that similar or the same as achieving certainty?
If I understand the most common usages of these terms, it would be beyond certainty. Usually, for most of us, recognition and resolution and liberation happen not all at once. So certainty would have to be at least occurring during the second of those three phases.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is from online. If you meditate on absolute bodhicitta as the very secret, do you keep in mind the other levels? Is secrecy or just the one aspect?
I think the instruction would be to keep them all in mind. But how you would do that, I don't know. See, the elephant in the room here is that if you know our practices, this all just spins by very quickly. So contemplate the emptiness of all things and then give rise to spontaneously present compassion for all beings and then emanate the seed. I mean, it sounds great. And I'm sure if somebody like Barway Dorje does it, that all happens. But no, it's like we do our best.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I'm going to be honest with and it's a little scary. But I realized now, for me, I know there's like no I, but for me, to study and meditate on green Torah, which eliminates all fear. For many years since I've been doing this, I've been thinking of external fear, not internal fear. And what I realize as you've been teaching this and I've been reading it with you and listening, I realize that I have a fear of being realized. It's scary to me, somewhere in my body, that I was trying to figure that out in my mind, it's an intellectual. I say, well, I think of people, it's so beautiful, magnificent. I can feel it in my heart. But I realize one of my obstructions is that to be realized completely as the teaching here describes it, there's something scary about it. Being kind of so powerful, and yet when I look at the great teachers and I listen to them and I watch a lot when the different lamas and Bartuku, when they would interact with us, the students, because I would learn so much about how, even during making, the kapcha or whatever.
Kapse.
Yeah. There are a group of people all there at the table, and there were a couple, other than Bardo Tuko, a few Rinpoches, okay, maybe not totally enlightened, but better in their enlightenment than certainly where I am. I noticed how those people responded to people that kind of, have to say, innerly were irritating me, And so it's so good, to be in a group here with people who are more enlightened or actually enlightened, and see how they respond to, that. And so the desire, obviously, I'm interested in being realized or I wouldn't be here. But what I've noticed lately, sometimes we don't want to admit these things, right? We want to be in denial, is that it's scary. There's a part of it that's scary to be so powerful. And I think that's because all my life, in stories and television, powerful people were also not really too compassionate. When I see, the story of Garchen Rinpoche, for instance, it's a whole completely different thing into what my image is, or it's not an image I want. It's just there. So is there a solution?
Well, there are three things. First of all, your question really speaks to me, because fear is something very close to my heart, unfortunately. And I've also heard this question answered. The first thing about it is that when we consider Buddhahood or realization, we are considering something that is admittedly quite foreign to our experience. And because it's an unknown, it's frightening. I don't think you're the only person who feels this. In my own case, what I notice is that I tend to project my negative fears of impassive, stern authority figures on Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And so when I think of them with fear or shame, then I think that's where it comes from. It comes from that. But to give the answer that I have heard for this, fear is basically a fear of one or both of two things. Pain, which could be mental or physical, and loss. Most of our fears are fear of one or the other, or both of those. So, for example, we fear death because we expect it's going to be painful and then we're going to lose everything. But the state of Buddhahood, the state of realization, is a state beyond all pain. There is no reason to fear it. As responsive as Buddhas are in helping beings, and however they choose to appear among us, they are not actually in pain as we know it. Well, to be more specific, one of the greatest teachers I ever met said this. Said, "You still feel pleasure and pain, but they're not a big deal." And that's huge for me, because what makes pain bad is its big dealness, right? So I don't think we need to fear that the state of awakening or enlightenment is painful. So then that brings us to the second thing, which is loss. And sometimes we fear it because we fear the loss of ourselves, loss of self, loss of identity, loss of what we've done, where we've been, who we've known, and everything. But again, as I've heard it said, you don't lose anything by becoming a Buddha. You have everything. That's why we call it Sambhoga Kaya. Sam means all or perfect. Bhoga means enjoyment. Buddhas, however we may perceive them, experience a level of well-being which is devoid of any deprivation, devoid of any unsatisfied wish, because they have no selfishness. And the lack of selfishness is not, the loss of selfishness is not really a loss. It's an acquisition, because you become who you really are, who you always were. That's how I've heard it explained. You're welcome.
Thank you for this teaching. I don't really understand a lot, but I'm trying. So recently, speaking about obstacles, I have been facing a lot, or I guess I've been perceiving them as such, but my perspective is kind of beginning to change, or at least I'm seeing them a little bit differently. Instead of like they're there just to punish me and just to make me suffer and just grind me down, whatever, kind of the nihilistic point of view. I'm starting to kind of, and then normally I would avoid it. I'm starting to begin to kind of, like, not avoid it and kind of stop seeing it as, this is just not nonsense, but just punishment without cause. Well, not without cause, but just, like that. And so I'm starting to kind of see it as, hey, this is actually a good thing because this is actually challenging me and getting me stronger. So I'm kind of avoiding those experiences, and sometimes when I have these fears, I just kind of like say to myself, okay, let it happen, like if whatever, if I get in a crash, let it happen, And I want to make sure, I hope that, this is making my practice and, my actions and everything a little bit better, because when I run away from things and, I want to avoid them, it's obviously not good, but I also don't want to become like, have wrong view that these are, that what I'm doing and how I'm kind of perceiving them is the wrong view. And so I'm wondering, is this, you know, a good view to kind of see obstacles like happening to me, not absolutely everything, but as a good thing, I guess, like good for practice and good for kind of expelling karma and, you know, opportunity to strengthen.
Yes. But there are two aspects to this. One aspect, you know, and this is, because you brought up, is it a good view to have? One aspect is the view, and the other aspect is what you do, how you live your life, conduct or behavior. We often quote Guru Rinpoche as saying, your view, even if your view is as high as space itself, your conduct must be as precise as finest ground flour. So we sort of need to have two parameters in our practice. I'm going to deal with the conduct first, and then the view. We have to respect our limitations at any given time. We cannot subject ourselves to situations or circumstances that will cause us to burn out, to lose hope, or to just flip out utterly. You know, when I came out of retreat the second time, I thought I was much stronger than I was. I mean, I thought I was 30, that I was much stronger than I am now. Now I'm 65, so I'm just, you know, and some of it consists of trying to force ourselves to fit the Procrustean bed of our ideals. And we have to be realistic. And Barway Dorje used to talk about this a lot, and he had a lovely way of explaining it. It was so helpful. He said, whenever you look at the path, and he was speaking specifically of the Mahayana, because he was teaching Bodhicharyavatara, but he would also say it about Vajrayana in other contexts. Whenever you look at the path, it's so vast. It's so mind-boggling in its immensity, in its profundity, in its excellence. He said, don't allow that to turn the path into kind of a vehicle of self-disparagement. He said, when you look at the path and it seems very, very restrictive and narrow, you're probably looking at it not the right way. When you look at the path and it seems incomparably wide open, you're on the right track. They used to say this again and again and again. This path is open. It is wide open. It is not narrow. It is not restrictive. So that means that we can, you know, as practitioners who are trying to become bodhisattvas, we have to accept that, you know, I can't do what who was it, Aryadeva did, and just carve out my eye and give it to somebody. Because if I did do that, and Rinpoche used to talk about this, then I would regret it, and that would be worse than not having done it. So in other words, don't use the Mahayana as an excuse for casting yourself into harm's way. If you can help others in an effective and appropriate way to the best of your judgment, then go ahead. And don't be afraid to put the greater need of others ahead of your minor need. That's okay. But sometimes we get narrow. And as you said, this idea of punishment. Now, the other thing is about the view. And it occurred to me last night. And this again was something that Barway Dorje used to always say. Whenever he gave the vow of refuge, he would introduce the Buddha as, taking refuge in the Buddha as a teacher because of 4 particular attributes the Buddha had. 4-fold fearlessness. Freedom from fear in proclaiming that he has abandoned all that is to be abandoned, or relinquished all that is to be relinquished. Freedom from fear in proclaiming that he has realized everything that is to be realized, and for the good of others, freedom from fear in proclaiming the path and the obstacles on the path. Now, I must have translated this 100 or more times, because everywhere Rinpoche went, he would give the vow of refuge, and he always gave the same introduction. And I couldn't quite grasp it for a while. Why is Rinpoche focusing on those aspects? What is it? And the first thing I began to understand was that he was talking about why the Buddha is trustworthy and reliable. And it means that as a teacher, he's not intimidated. He's not afraid to tell the truth. And then I still couldn't understand why Rinpoche always said the obstacles on the path. And then I got it. I realized that because the obstacles are what you walk on as you progress on the path. If I needed to walk over to where you are, the distance between us would be the obstacle to my doing that. But it's also the only way I could get over there. I'd have to walk on the floor. So what we call obstacles, and this is the view, and this is why you have to be careful not to become idealistic, what we call obstacles are the path, the substance of the path. Because it's only by overcoming our problems that we change. If you go to the gym, you're not going to have a good result if you don't use forces, like you lift weights to strengthen yourself. The weights are an obstacle to physical well-being. You wouldn't want to be carrying around heavy weights everywhere you had to go. That would be a burden. And yet you do it intentionally. Why? Because you want to get stronger. So that's the theory, that's the view. But in practice, we have to be gentle with ourselves. And we have to remember, as His Holiness the 17th Karmapa has said many times, sometimes I was there, if you don't love yourself, you can't love anyone else. Because you can't give what you don't have. You can't make an exception of yourself. You can't say, yes, I love all sentient beings, but it doesn't work that way. You can't constantly reinforce self-disparagement.
It's me. Hi.
Oh.
Thank you for the teachings. I want to play off of what the last two questions were. So as one goes along the path, there's some illusions that get eroded, and then one might find oneself without those illusions, but not really able to inhabit a view that's...
Yeah.
So I think you understand what I'm saying. The question I have is the fear that Phyllis spoke of can, I think, pop up in ways where you, and it is also disparagement, where you go, oh, I am so far below where I thought I was, which is not a bad thing necessarily, but it can also play into, it's a way of assuaging a fear of being more open and stronger, and so I associate that to some extent with, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's associated with this idea of divine pride as the deity, and how to sort of is, other than just doing Yidam practice generation stage, is there some aspects within that that could address that I worry that I fall into fear as a very easy way of saying, oh, you're, and I'm not self-disparaging in the sense that I hate myself, but self-disparaging in that don't go there because you're not there yet. So, but that's really just fear talking.
There are three things that struck me about what you said. The first thing, we make everything very complicated, and I'm speaking of myself here because I'm infamous for overcomplicating things, but the view articulated in the generation stage, as we find in our Guru Rinpoche Tsok Puja, is everything is the play of the deity. So the Vajra pride has to be the sense that everyone and everything is a deity, a wisdom deity. If you have that, or to the extent that you have that, because it's not either or, and I'll get back to that. To the extent that you have that, self-disparagement becomes superfluous. It's not that you, because I used to be able to do this better, and I can't now, and I'll get to that, which is to do with another part of your question, but it's not that you despise yourself for engaging in self-disparagement. That would be an endless loop. I've been caught in that too. It falls off. But that brings me to the other thing, which is that we have kind of, and I'm speaking of myself here, so it may not apply totally to you, but it seems to based on your question. We have two fears in terms of progress on the path. Self-indulgence or laziness. We're afraid of taking it too easy on ourselves. And what's the other one? Rigidity. And I think from what I've seen in my own experience and in my dealings with others, rigidity always seems to appear where there is unquestioned self-disparagement. It always, when I've become rigid and when I've interacted with others that I knew well enough to be able to see what was going on, when we become rigid, I think it's because there's an unquestioned core of unresolved darkness in our hearts, or in my heart, that I'm either temporarily unable to access and expunge it, or I'm not willing to question it yet. Self-indulgence is harder for me. It's when I get tired or sick, it's very, very hard for me to keep going. But I think that the fear is navigation between those two. It's like walking a fence and trying not to fall onto either side. Now, I don't know if that answered your question or not, because again, I'm making it very more, personal about me. But so the first thing is really just, if you're the deity, everyone's the deity. Everything is the deity. And, I think in one of his books, Dzongtse Gyamtso Rinpoche wrote it beautifully. He said, Vajradhara says, everything is a deity. And in that one sentence, he basically describes at least the view of the generation stage, and I would argue the completion stage as well. I think that basically, that's it. That is the Vajrayana. Everything is already the deity. And, I remember what the other thing was. The fear that goes with the fear of self-indulgence is the fear of backsliding. And you remember I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that I was once able to let go of self-disparagement because of mistakes I've made in my life, because of weakness, mental health issues, getting involved in disputes and so on. I've lost that ability. I seek to get it back, but it's very, very, very hard. So this is the reason why they talk so much about purification practices. It sounds so judgmental when they talk about it. It sounds so harsh and militant and everything. But it's basically, we all have to not lose our experience. And that's why, we try to practice every day. We try to do what we can do. Because it's also about progress, but it's also very possible to lose good, valid experience and insight. Obviously, high realization, no. But that's not what we're talking about. All right, let's dedicate the...
Can I just say, so just everyone online, I'll do your questions this afternoon.
Yes. Sonam de ye damje sing pa ni do ne nye be ranam banje ne jenga na je ba la ro ba ye simbe zo le ro wa roba jo ke wan de yin je wo gun sunam ye shen zon zon de sanam ye je le jong we damba gun ye damba jo Gyamtso zemne rinpoche manje balang je jorje chemba nyamba me badang gonne gondo bawajo semje damje de dan den jorje Endo damje da do dong par jo Zhang zhe samba kanda za shom ba De da guan je ma lam zhong ba jo Song je ring je zi zin dam pe gar Jangguan du shan du du ling bai Am je me jong de bu song a je Si je zhong da zha be da shi. Thank you, everyone.